Welcome back to Breathing Space, the quietest corner of the internet. I'm Sam Jarvis. If you're struggling to drift off to sleep tonight, know that that's okay. You're in the right place. Hit the follow button now for access to more relaxing bedtime stories and start drifting off a little easier night after night. Before we revisit another rich Arthurian legend, half torn from the pages of Anglo-Norman French, Le Morte d'Arthur, and glued back together with the whisperings, legends, myths, and folklore that has survived the centuries. Let's take a moment to wind down and relax. Come to settle in a comfortable position and allow your eyes to gently drift closed. Welcome a deep breath in through your nose. Hold it for a moment and sigh out in relief. Breathe in and out. Inhale and exhale. Feel yourself sinking deeper and deeper into relaxation with each soothing cycle of your breath. Feel your muscles relax, your mind clear, and your breath deepen. Here, in this moment, know that you are safe. You are loved. You are important. With each cycle of your breath, you are strengthening the connection between your mind, body, and being by taking this time for yourself to relax, to sleep. You are nourishing the most sacred relationship there is, the relationship you hold with yourself. Say a silent thank you to yourself for allowing yourself a moment to rest as you let your mind unwind to the tune of my voice. Now, if you're feeling ready, allow me to tell you a story. This is the tale of Merlin, the wise old wizard, counsel to the great King Arthur. By all accounts, Merlin was a kind old wizard. For centuries his name has been heralded across Avalon and whispered deep in the crush of narrow, cobbled streets that made up Camelot. But this is not the well-told tale of the aged sorcerer who sealed his soul willingly in the trunk of an even older tree and welcomed an eternal slumber. This is the tale of a boy, born to a mortal woman on the borders of Camelot, and the Cambion, the shape-shifting demon she had fallen in love with. Like most, Merlin spent much of his youth unsure of who he was. Indeed, in recent years his character has gotten muddied by producers and penmen alike, his traits traded out for more likable ones. Though contemporary interpretations have branded him as boyish and bumbling, good-hearted and reluctantly heroic, the oldest tales tell rather a different story. Though no less steeped in magic, the earliest stories of Merlin have always seemed rather more believable to me, and perhaps a little more honest. This is the story of a young man, just as lost perhaps as you and I have felt at times. This is the story of someone flawed, someone human, or rather, human enough to have his heart and mind a tangle. Lucifer and his comrades had tested the patience of those that resided above the cloud line in heaven. For centuries they had played tricks on the angels, pushing and pushing to see how far the forgiveness they preached would extend. It took thousands of years for them to finally push too far and get themselves exiled. They had never heard of the Son of God, Jesus, Christ's representative on earth, had been hidden from them for centuries, shrouded by the cloud line, perhaps intentionally. Once the devil and his demons had been banished to earth, it took no time at all for the preachings of the Son of God to reach them. They found themselves vilified in the Bible's writings. The friends they were able to make on earth, they lost in the instance they revealed their true nature. They could feel fear ebbing off of people each time they ducked out of the tavern they were lodging in. And after a time, I think perhaps that fear became unbearable for them. Lucifer had never felt at home in heaven. He would never be made welcome on earth, and so the demons and he made plans to carve out an underworld where they could hold their own court and live and thrive, and where their sneers, their sharp features, and their vicious beauty without judgment from the soft-skinned mortals who still breathed and bled, and the deities who had rejected them. There was, however, a secondary part to Lucifer's plan, one that the devil has done well to keep to himself over the centuries. Only his innermost circle were responsible for enacting the secondary part of his scheme, and over the centuries most have managed to keep tight-lipped about the events that transpired in the wake of Lucifer's move beneath the surface of the earth. The smattering of people that know the sordid details now learned it only through whisperings, through family folklore and gossip. Lucifer desired to have his own representative on earth, and without a wife or a child of his own, he sent one of the greatest shapeshifters that had ever lived back above to tread the land and sire a child with a human woman, one that he hoped would look mortal enough to be accepted by the humans, but would pertain the same powers as he did. That child would one day come to be known as Merlin. In the stories I have heard, the demon itself never bore a name of his own, but to young Etana, the soon-to-be mother of Merlin, the demon would always be known as Aneurin. The face Aneurin wore for her was a handsome one, rugged in all the right places. His shoulders spanned wider than the rest of the shoulders that Etana had seen in the village on market day, and though the demon felt a shrunken version of himself whenever he bore Aneurin's body, Etana saw only light and strength in the set of his shoulders when she looked at him. The story of Aneurin and Etana has been twisted and twisted for centuries. The shapeshifter has been painted as the most heartless of beings by the angels, and the most devious and manipulative by mankind. The truth of it is that Aneurin did come to love Etana. He held her and he laughed with her, and he snuck through her bedroom window by night and tried to put to rights the harshness and cruelty of life in Camelot all those centuries ago. No one had ever handed Etana anything, and though a hard life in harsh weather had made those in her family cruel, a softness had remained in her, an openness, a desire to love and be loved. Lucifer would have you believe that Adhana had no idea who or what Aneurin was, but I've heard it said that he told her, and that he never even needed to. Deep down, Adhana had always been able to sense something beneath his skin. It was always warm to the touch. After long hours spent in the underworld, his pulse ran slower than hers. Even when the night had been a heady one, he never seemed to break a sweat or crave a breath. He didn't seem to need oxygen nearly half as much as he seemed to need her. Lucifer hadn't considered that Aneurin might fall in love with the mortal, or that when he did, the demon might try to avoid putting Lucifer's plan into action to save Adhana from the inevitable judgment she would receive in Camelot for bearing a child, a half-demon no less, out of wedlock. In a shocking display of compassion, Lucifer granted his friend time. Ultimately, when Aneurin could no longer bear to be away from her, he wed Adhana, resigned to spend the rest of his life beside her in the human realm, and together they bore a child, Merlin. Merlin was born to be an anarchist. That is what Lucifer had intended for him, and the devil, by that time far too distracted by the flourishing underworld, assumed he had left the child in safe hands that would guide him toward the darkness. But Adhana had awakened a kindness, an inner ease in Aneurin, and together they raised the boy to be kind and to always be as compassionate as he could be. They kept Merlin's true nature from him for much of his youth, not knowing that even as a young boy, Merlin had begun to experience symptoms of his power. The boy had kept them to himself for fear there was something deeply evil about the core of his being. For a long time, Merlin felt he didn't quite recognize the face that stared back at him in reflections. The weather in Camelot left much to be desired. It seemed that Avalon, across the border, caught the sun, and Camelot only the rain and snow. In the puddles and frozen window panes, Merlin was sure he caught his features changing shape, and not in the sense that the other children's were. Their chubby cheeks hollowed out and their brows grew more severe, but Merlin was quite sure that on Monday he had had blue eyes, and by the following Wednesday they had turned a deep brown. When he turned 14 and went out to work, the full effects of Merlin's powers began to show their flare. Working in the fields, he could sense the storms before they arrived, and when he spoke to the horses and the sheep in their pastures on his walk home, he was quite sure he could hear their voices inside his mind. There was much unrest between Avalon and Camelot at the time, and by age 16, aware of his powers and at last coming into his own, Merlin was overcome by a premonition more vivid than any he had had before, and any he would ever have in the future. Merlin knew to create peace between the realms, it was his responsibility to guide the not yet conceived King Arthur in his reign, and ensure the king valued peace and fought only to achieve it, or when he felt sure it was at stake. The tales that come between Merlin's 16th year and his 600th one are long ones, and perhaps we'll find time for them another night. Remember, much of tonight's tale has been kept secret for centuries, and some things are best kept that way. This is the story of the Lady of the Lake and a young Sir Lancelot. Vivien had been called a lot of things over the years. The Lady of the Lake, Nimue, even Ninian or Ninien for a while, which she hadn't liked too much. They had called her Nimench, Nivian, Niviana, Niman and Ninian. More recently though, from her home on the borders of Avalon, she had heard the name Nimue carrying across the plains in the breeze. It had been whispered by scholars living either side of the boundary separating those who slept and woke and worked and said the Lord's Prayer before bed, and those who slept less and woke only to wish, to cast their magic out all day long and sing their incantations to the moon and stars. She rather hoped Nimue would stick, for she had accepted long ago that her true name, Vivien, was already lost to time, and hoped at least that when the people of Avalon finally began to take seriously the recording of information, events, names and dates, it would be the name Nimue they inked into eternity upon the parchment, for she thought it rang rather nicely at the ears. Centuries after Vivien's story was concluded, a book of Anglo-English folklore named Le Morte d'Arthur was first scribbled out onto parchment and bound to the spine of a book. Much to her relief, the name Nimue was indeed the name used. Though Le Morte d'Arthur was not the only recount of the infamous Lady of the Lakes story, it is perhaps the earliest and most widely recognized. Some say that as time went by, the tales of her became fantastical and painted her with a power and greed she simply did not possess. But that has always been the case with stories passed from person to person and only written down thereafter. Those, and indeed these, stories are of course to be taken with a pinch of salt, but I'd wager that all the best tales ought to be. For decades Vivien lived alone, the quiet of her solitude made even quieter by the water that washed through her palace beneath the lake. The waters of the lake were generally still enough to reflect the stars in the night sky, and one might easily have mistaken it for a puddle of the cosmos that had dripped down from the heavens to pool on the outskirts of Avalon. She couldn't hear the tap of her feet against the stone steps beneath them. The water stifled sounds like that. When she cooked, the clatter of pans and spattering of oil never crowded her. Beneath the surface of the lake, there was only the sound of her thoughts and the gentle wash of the water to greet her each morning as she awoke. For a long time, that was exactly how Vivien liked it. In the early days, when the borders were not settled and the men still banded together to fight over them, there were far more footprints in the mud surrounding the lake she called home. But, for all the fighting, it was time that had settled most of the disputes. With many having lost so much to the conflict, they could hardly find it in themselves to care about defining borders and staking a claim to patches of land too sodden with lake water to plant crops anyway. The quarreling finally stopped, and so too, in large part, did the animosity. Those that lived beyond the Veil of Magic in Avalon, where the Lady of the Lake made her home, tended not to interfere with the dealings of those that lived in the human realm, and the humans beyond the border had ceased to fear or dread encounters with their magical counterparts. Before the fighting had drawn to a close, Vivien had done the great King Arthur of Camelot an even greater favor. After the sword he pulled from the stone shattered in battle, his magical advisor Merlin took him to see Vivien where she resided in the lake. Merlin encouraged Arthur to throw the fragments of his sword into the lake, and putting his trust in the wizard, he did just that. Merlin drew back to the battlefield, but Arthur waited, as instructed, with nothing but the stillness of the lake and his empty hands to keep him company. It seemed an eternity had passed when Arthur first noticed a rippling on the surface of the water, a rumbling from its depths. Steadfast and brave, he stood resolute in the face of a magic he would never quite be able to understand. When Vivien's head first crested the surface of the water, it was her red hair that caught Arthur's attention first. It gave way to the alabaster planes of her face, and eyes as blue as the waters from which she had emerged. She continued to rise without the tide, and as her form was revealed, he saw the sword balanced upon her open palms. She carried it towards him, bringing it just near enough that he could recognize the hilt he had thrown into the water, and the inscription upon the blade that had once been buried deep in a stone that only he had been able to pull it from. "It is Arthur, is it not?" Vivien asked, and he dared not ask her to address him as king, for it was clear to see that Vivien was a law unto her own. Arthur nodded, words deserting him as she came closer still. "This sword goes by a different name now. I call it Excalibur, and you would be wise to as well," she asserted. "Excalibur it is," the king nodded, noticing the glow that radiated from the sword as he spoke its name and called to it. "I bound it with my magic, and so you might find it capable of a little more than the one you pulled from the stone." Vivien smiled. Arthur nodded in thanks and almost expected the conditions the Lady of the Lake laid out for him before she handed him the sword. "I grant you this sword on the condition that you fight only for peace, for freedom of religion in Avalon and Camelot alike, so that one day there can be peace betwixt the two realms. I grant it to you on the condition that should you hear my call, you heed it. What say you, Arthur?" It is widely known that Arthur agreed to Vivien's terms, but that afternoon, as he wandered away from the lake and rather reluctantly back to the battlefield, Arthur himself hardly knew what he had agreed to, just that he and the Lady of the Lake shared a common goal in establishing peace between the two realms. Perhaps the Lady of the Lake did possess a power that made most uncomfortable, but Arthur could sense that her heart was good, even if time had twisted it up a little over the centuries. When a young Sir Lancelot, out exploring beyond the bounds of where he had been born, lingered by the lakeside, he thought perhaps to stay the night. Lancelot, too, had found himself alone in the world at a young age, and so when Vivien first rose from the center of the lake and began a slow swim toward him, he wasn't afraid. Like a fawn before its first winter, Lancelot didn't yet know the evils of the earth well enough to run from them. He had spent so much of his short life wanting for people, for a family, for friends to call his own, that he had yet to realize that some people are simply not worth sharing your life with. As Vivien made her approach, she found herself rather moved that the boy didn't recoil. Even at only 8 years old, he didn't shuffle backwards up the beach or look as uncomfortable as even the knights who had come specifically to seek an audience with her tended to. Here was Lancelot, still young enough to be without prejudice, without judgment of the woman who chose to live alone beneath the waters of the lake. He didn't know Vivien was the woman who had given Excalibur willingly to ensure the right side won, or that she had made it her business to trap the wizard Merlin in a tree for 1,000 years for expecting her love in return for lessons. Lancelot had found himself alone in life, and even after the world had treated him with such cruelty and forced him into such solitude, his heart had remained good. Vivien recognized much of herself in him, and for that reason took the boy in without thought. She taught him honor and bravery and gentleness. She taught him his sums and how to take clippings from the flowers around the lake so that they could grow more together. When he was old enough, with a heavy heart, she sent him out into the world once more. Lancelot was bound for the kingdom of Lagresse and became known as the White Knight for his platinum blonde hair. Though he missed the home Vivien had built for them, he knew she was never far out of reach. Upon his index finger he wore a ring she had bestowed upon him and insisted he wear every day since. The ring protected him from enchantments that anyone tried to place upon him. Even when years had passed and Lancelot had grown his own family, Vivien still looked out for him in her own way. There was a kindness about Vivien, an evenness to the way she chose to conduct herself, and even if, in the tales that carried across the plains, they called her cold and wicked and hard-hearted, she knew it not to be the truth, and in raising him, she had proved it to Lancelot. Vivien had been born more beautiful than most, and not long after she sent Lancelot away to live the life she had prepared him for, the wizard Merlin came calling once more. Vivien was strong, but she was a good deal younger than Merlin, and much suspected that there was a great deal of knowledge she could learn from the ancient wizard. It seemed vital to her to study the ways of the old world before they were lost to time entirely. Merlin had been in love with Vivien for decades by the time their paths crossed for a second time. In truth, he had fallen far and fast for her, ever since that fateful day at the lake with Arthur, where he had hidden between the trees and watched her emerge with the enchanted Excalibur. Merlin had thought of her and visited her in his dreams, night after night, until he could no longer bear the distance between them and sought her out once more. When she rose to meet him at the edge of the lake and he stepped into the water, a prophecy shook him to his very core, a premonition of sorts. Merlin knew that the Lady of the Lake would trap him, that Vivien would be his end, and yet he had fallen so in love with her that When she asked him to teach her all that he knew, the wizard did as she wished, and knowingly sealed his own fate. Day by day, the pair stooped over the inky pages of old grimoires, and night after night, Merlin gifted Vivien freely all of the spells and rituals that would one day serve as her weapons against him. When there was no longer anything she could learn from the old wizard, whom she had promised her heart so long as he taught her everything he knew, Vivien sealed his soul in the trunk of a great old tree, suspending him in an eternal, deep and peaceful slumber. Perhaps what Vivien did was unfair. Perhaps it was wrong of her, for she later took the old wizard's role as Arthur's magical advisor. But some say that perhaps Merlin welcomed his fate. One has to wonder if maybe the wizard had been ready to rest in the trunk of that great tree after so long walking the earth. Perhaps Merlin was due a long and restful sleep, and perhaps you are too.